If you've ever seen those old World War II photos with the shark-faced fighters, you've seen the P-40 Warhawk. That iconic grin painted on the nose became one of the most recognizable images of the war. But behind that aggressive paint job was an aircraft that forced pilots to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, and a lot of them didn't know it until they were already in combat. The Curtiss P-40 rolled out in 1938, and on paper it looked like exactly what the Army Air Corps needed. Curtiss-Wright, one of America's biggest aircraft manufacturers at the time, promised a fighter that could outclimb, outrun, and outfight anything in the sky. The engineers threw around impressive numbers: top speed of 357 miles per hour, service ceiling of 29,000 feet, rate of climb that would get you to altitude faster than the competition. Military planners saw those specs and started writing checks. By 1939, the Army had ordered over 500 units. France and Britain, already at war with Germany, wanted them too. The P-40 was going to be the backbone of Allied air power. Curtiss was churning out promotional materials showing the Warhawk dominating enemy fighters in dogfights. Pilots in training were told they'd be flying one of the most advanced fighters in the world. But here's the thing, those performance numbers, they were based on ideal conditions that basically never existed in actual combat. The engineers knew it, Curtiss knew it, and they sold it anyway. The real P-40 couldn't hit those speeds at combat weight, it couldn't climb like they said, and at high altitude, where a lot of the fighting happened, it was a completely different animal than what was promised. By the time pilots figured this out, they were already over Burma, North Africa, and the Pacific, facing enemies who had no problem exploiting every single one of the P-40's weaknesses. The first real wake-up call came when P-40s started going up against Japanese Zeros and German Bf-109s. Pilots quickly realized something was very wrong. The aircraft they'd trained on wasn't performing like the one they were fighting in, at all. Take the climb rate. Curtiss had advertised the P-40 could climb at around 2,750 feet per minute. In actual combat conditions with full fuel, ammunition, and armor plating, pilots were seeing maybe 2,000 feet per minute on a good day. That doesn't sound like a huge difference until you're trying to gain altitude on an enemy fighter that's already above you. Those extra seconds meant life or death. The top speed issue was even worse. That promised 357 miles per hour? Most pilots couldn't get much past 330 in level flight at combat weight. And here's the real kicker, at altitude above 15,000 feet, the P-40's Allison V-1710 engine started gasping for air. It didn't have a supercharger that could handle high-altitude operations effectively. German and Japanese fighters could dance around at 20,000 or 25,000 feet with no problem. The P-40 up there felt like it was moving through mud. I discovered through pilot accounts that many felt betrayed when they first engaged the enemy. One pilot from the American Volunteer Group in China wrote that he felt like he'd been sold a lemon with wings. Another described the moment he tried to climb after a Zero and watched it pull away effortlessly as the loneliest feeling in the world. The service ceiling was listed at 29,000 feet, but operationally, most squadrons wouldn't take them much above 20,000 because the performance degradation was so severe. You could get it up there technically, but you'd be slow, sluggish, and completely vulnerable. Enemy fighters at that altitude could practically pick their shots. So how did this happen? How did one of America's premier aircraft companies put out a fighter with specs that didn't match reality? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to a few things: competition, desperation, and corners cut in the name of profit. In the late 1930s, aircraft manufacturers were in a brutal race to win military contracts. Curtiss-Wright was competing against companies like Lockheed, Republic, and Bell. Everyone was promising the moon. The company that could show the best performance numbers on paper got the order. It was that simple. Curtiss tested the P-40 prototype under absolutely perfect conditions. Minimal fuel load, no armor, no combat equipment, experienced test pilots flying at optimal altitudes and temperatures. They recorded the best possible numbers and submitted those to the military. Technically, the aircraft could achieve those figures, just not in any scenario that resembled actual combat. The military procurement officers at the time weren't stupid, but they were under pressure too. War was already raging in Europe and Asia. America needed fighters, and it needed them fast. There wasn't time for extensive independent testing. If Curtiss said the P-40 could do something, the Army basically had to take their word for it and hope it worked out. What makes this worse is that Curtiss likely knew the engine was the weak point. The Allison V-1710 was a solid power plant at low to medium altitude, but it wasn't designed for high-altitude combat. Other countries were developing turbocharged and supercharged engines specifically for that purpose. Curtiss stuck with what they had because retooling would cost money and delay production. By the time the problems became obvious, thousands of P-40s were already built or on order. Contracts were signed, money had changed hands. Fixing it would mean admitting the issue, scrapping aircraft, redesigning systems, and potentially facing lawsuits or military penalties. Here's where the story gets interesting. Instead of just accepting that they had an inferior aircraft, some pilots figured out how to fight with what they had. The most famous example is the American volunteer group in China, better known as the Flying Tigers. Claire Chennault, the commander of the Flying Tigers, knew exactly what the P-40 couldn't do. He'd studied the Japanese Zero extensively. It could outturn the P-40, it could outclimb it. At high altitude, it was faster. In a traditional dogfight, the Zero won almost every time, so Chennault told his pilots, don't dogfight. Instead, he developed tactics that played to the P-40's actual strengths. The Warhawk was tough. It had better armor than the Zero. It could take hits and keep flying. It was also heavier, which meant in a dive it was faster than almost anything else in the sky. And its 650 caliber machine guns hit hard when they connected. Chennault's strategy was simple but required incredible discipline. Get above the enemy using ground-based early warning systems and patience. Dive down at high speed, make one high-speed firing pass, then keep diving and use that speed to extend away before the enemy could react. Never, ever try to turn with a Zero. If you couldn't get the kill on the first pass, you live to try again later. This tactics manual, called Boom and Zoom, turned the P-40's weaknesses into manageable problems. The Flying Tigers racked up an impressive kill ratio using these methods. Some estimates put it at 10-to-1 or better, though exact numbers are disputed. What's not disputed is that they made the P-40 work, despite its limitations. But here's the thing, this only worked because Chennault had time to train his pilots and the luxury of choosing when and where to fight. Not every P-40 squadron had the advantages the Flying Tigers did. In North Africa, the Pacific, and other theaters, pilots were forced into situations where boom and zoom wasn't an option. And that's when the performance lies really started killing people. In North Africa, P-40s from the Royal Air Force and U.S. Army Air Forces had to escort bombers and protect ground troops. You can't just dive away when you're supposed to be defending something. German Bf-109s and Italian fighters would climb above the P-40 formations, force them into turning fights, and pick them apart. Pilot losses were significant in the early campaigns. Over the Pacific, especially around places like New Guinea and the Philippines, P-40 pilots faced Zeros in conditions where they couldn't always dictate the terms of engagement. If you got jumped from above, or if you were already low on fuel, or if you were protecting a convoy, you fought with what you had. And what you had wasn't enough. I found accounts from pilots who described the horrible moment when they realized they couldn't escape. One P-40 pilot over the Philippines wrote about being caught in a climbing fight with 2 Zeros. He pushed his throttle to the stop, pulled back on the stick, and watched his airspeed bleed off while the Zeros just kept coming. He survived by sheer luck, his aircraft taking hits that would have downed a less sturdy plane. The armor and rugged construction saved a lot of lives, no question, but it was a consolation prize for an aircraft that shouldn't have been in that position in the first place. Pilots knew if the engine had delivered what was promised, if the climb rate was real, if the high-altitude performance existed, they'd have more options. Instead, they were constantly fighting defensively, reacting, trying to survive rather than dominate. After the war, researchers started digging into what actually happened with the P-40's development and how those inflated specifications made it into official documents. What they found was a messy trail of optimistic testing, selective reporting, and a military procurement system that didn't have enough oversight. Curtiss-Wright's test reports from 1938 and 1939 show performance figures that were achieved, but with critical context missing. The top speed runs were done at specific altitudes with minimal weight. Climb tests were similarly optimized. When you read the fine print, the conditions were noted, but the headline numbers were what got circulated to procurement officers and publicized to the press. The Army Air Corps did conduct some independent testing, but it was limited. They confirmed the P-40 could reach the advertised speeds under test conditions. What they didn't do was extensive combat-loaded trials at various altitudes with full tactical scenarios. That kind of testing takes time and resources that weren't available as war loomed. Internal Curtiss documents, some of which came out in later years, show engineers raised concerns about the Allison engine's high-altitude performance. There were memos discussing the need for better supercharging, but the business side of the company pushed forward anyway. Delays meant losing contracts to competitors. The military wanted aircraft now, not in 2 years after a redesign. By 1941, it was clear the P-40 had serious limitations, but production was in full swing. Over 13,000 P-40s would eventually be built. The military had already invested massive amounts of money. Admitting the aircraft didn't meet specs would have been a political and financial disaster, so the official line remained that the P-40 was a capable frontline fighter, even as pilots were developing workarounds just to survive in it. It's impossible to know exactly how many pilots died specifically because the P-40 didn't perform as advertised. Combat is chaotic, and losses happen for all kinds of reasons. But there are documented cases where the aircraft's limitations were a direct factor. In early Pacific engagements, P-40 squadrons suffered disproportionate losses compared to what their numbers should have predicted. Some units saw casualty rates above 50% in the first months of combat. Pilots were lost trying to climb to intercept bombers, getting caught in turning engagements they couldn't escape, or simply being unable to run away when outnumbered because the top speed wasn't there. One particularly brutal example was the defense of the Philippines in late 1941 and early 1942. P-40s were essentially the only modern fighters available. They were outnumbered, outperformed, and rapidly worn down. Pilots fought with incredible bravery, but the aircraft put them at a disadvantage from the start. Many died, in situations where a better-performing fighter might have given them a chance. In North Africa, similar stories played out. P-40 pilots protecting ground forces or escorting bombers would get bounced by German fighters operating at higher altitudes. The delayed climb rate meant they often couldn't reach advantageous positions in time. Some made it home shot full of holes, others didn't. The psychological toll was significant too. Imagine being told you're flying a top-tier fighter only to discover in combat that you're actually in an inferior aircraft. That kind of realization, mid-battle, is devastating. It erodes trust in leadership, in equipment, in the whole system. Pilots started calling the P-40 nicknames that reflected their frustration. Some were printable, many weren't. Survivor accounts from late in the war often mention a sense of relief when units transitioned to better aircraft like the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. After the war ended, there was an effort to whitewash some of the P-40's problems, and the narrative became about brave pilots overcoming challenges, which was true, but it downplayed the fact that those challenges were partly due to corporate dishonesty and inadequate oversight. Official histories highlighted the Flying Tiger's success and the P-40's role in various theaters, which again was deserved. The aircraft did serve throughout the war, but there was less discussion about why it struggled, why pilots had to develop special tactics, and why so many were eager to get rid of it as soon as better options became available. Curtiss-Wright faced no significant consequences. They'd fulfilled their contracts. The aircraft met the specifications on paper, even if those specs didn't represent combat reality. And in the chaos of wartime production, with thousands of aircraft types being built by dozens of companies, there was no appetite for investigations or accountability. Some veterans did speak out. Memoirs and interviews from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s started telling the real story. Pilots who'd flown the P-40 were blunt about its shortcomings. Historians began looking at the documentation and seeing the gaps between promise and reality. By the 1980s and 90s, the full picture was pretty clear to anyone paying attention. Modern assessments of the P-40 are more balanced. It's recognized as a tough, reliable aircraft that served adequately in certain roles and theaters, but it's also acknowledged that it was outclassed by many opponents, and that pilot skill and tactics had to compensate for design and performance limitations. The question of whether Curtiss deliberately misled the military remains somewhat debated, but the evidence strongly suggests they knew the performance claims were optimistic at best. What didn't happen was any systemic reform. Military procurement continued to rely heavily on manufacturer testing and claims. The P-40 story isn't just historical trivia. It's a case study in what happens when profit motives, wartime urgency, and inadequate oversight collide. And honestly, we're still seeing versions of this problem today. Modern military procurement has more checks and balances than it did in the 1930s, but contractors still push the boundaries, performance claims still get exaggerated, corners still get cut. The F-35 program, for example, has faced years of criticism about costs, delays, and capabilities that don't quite match early promises. The difference is that now there's more scrutiny and transparency, though not always enough. What the P-40 taught us, or should have taught us, is that you can't just trust manufacturer specs. Independent testing under realistic conditions is essential. Combat-loaded trials matter. High-altitude performance matters. And the people using the equipment, the pilots and soldiers, need to be part of the evaluation process before mass production begins. The problem is that the incentives haven't really changed. Defense contractors are still businesses trying to win contracts and maximize profits. Military procurement officers are still under pressure to fill capability gaps quickly, especially when tensions are rising or conflicts are already underway. And politicians want to show they're supporting defense while also controlling budgets. That same triangle of pressures that pushed the P-40 into production despite its flaws still exists today. It also showed the importance of adaptability. The Flying Tigers proved that even flawed equipment can be effective with the right tactics and training, but that shouldn't be the default expectation. We shouldn't design systems assuming that the users will figure out workarounds. That's putting the burden in the wrong place. When we ask soldiers and pilots to compensate for engineering failures or corporate dishonesty with their own skill and courage, we're making them pay for someone else's mistakes. There's also a broader lesson here about institutional memory. The issues with the P-40 were well documented by the late 1940s, yet similar procurement problems kept happening. The M16 rifle had reliability issues in Vietnam, partly because testing wasn't done under realistic jungle conditions. The Bradley fighting vehicle went through years of mission creep and redesigns. The list goes on. Each generation seems to relearn these lessons at a cost, measured in both money and lives. For anyone interested in this kind of history, the P-40 is a reminder that the machines we build for war carry real consequences. Every exaggerated spec, every shortcut, every decision to prioritize production over performance affects human lives. The Warhawk flew throughout World War II and contributed to the Allied victory. Thousands of pilots flew it and survived, but some didn't, and some of those losses might have been preventable if the aircraft had been what it was supposed to be from the start. If you grew up reading about the Flying Tigers or seeing P-40s at air shows, it's a complex legacy to process. The shark mouth still looks cool. The stories of bravery are still inspiring, but underneath that is a harder truth about honesty, accountability, and the cost of cutting corners. Thank you for watching. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My friend, who is a chimerical pilot, said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories about airlines and the realities of modern travel like this deserve to be told. Help me show her that these videos matter. Please subscribe to the channel and let's keep these stories from being buried.